Hello, and welcome to today's Trainer Education webinar, Discovering Values, the Key to Unlocking Employee Engagement, hosted by HRDQ and presented by Dr. Cynthia Scott. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour. Before we begin, do note that there is a question. It might be labeled a chat box for you. It's usually located in the top right-hand corner of your screen. There you can submit any questions throughout the webinar that you may have, and then we'll either answer those questions as they come in or by email after the session. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I am in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Today's presenter is Dr. Cynthia Scott. She is a founding principal of ChangeWorks Global and is a recognized leader with over 25 years of experience in the fields of strategic navigation of continual organizational change and sustainable leadership. She is a core faculty member at the Presidio Graduate School MBA and Executive Certificate Program in Sustainable Leadership. Cynthia is the author of numerous books, including Rekindling Commitment and Take This Work and Love It. And her work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, the Stanford Business School Newsletter, and Worthwhile Magazine. Some of her clients include Blue Shield of California, Charles Schwab, Kaiser Permanente, AT&T, and Estee Lauder. Cynthia is also the author of the assessment Mastering the Change Curve and the Values Edge System. We are pleased to have Cynthia share her expertise with us today. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Cynthia.
I am glad to be here, Sarah. Thank you for putting all this together. Let's start with the question of why do values matter? And Sarah, I'm trying to advance my slides and I'm not seeing them advance. Is there something I'm not doing?
Did you move your arrow down?
Move my arrow down. Yep,
Still
my
not
arrow.
moving?
Why don't you advance my slides then? There we
There
go.
we go.
There we go. Thank you. We had this
No problem.
all set up. So why do values matter? Why even talk about values? And what I've found is that they are the real foundation of what drives behavior. And they're the keys to passion and engagement. And they're the source of innovation, untapped often in organizations. What I've discovered over my work with organizations for the last 25 years is they often are ignored. People don't want to talk about values. They would rather talk about skills and technical kinds of focus when they look for motivation and productivity. My curiosity was, why do some companies draw talent, embrace innovation, and build their cultural capital? What are they doing? And what they seem to do is they pay attention to creating opportunities for employees to connect their individual and their individual values to their organizational purpose. Let's go to the next slide and look at why values are the language of why. The mistake I find organizations making is a lot of leaders and managers talk about what they're doing and how they do it, instead of why they do it. These are the conversations of why are what ignite this passion and commitment. And values are the language of why. I see leaders talking more about competition, challenges, strategy, but never talking about why the work matters. Because I write and teach about values, I get funny phone calls. Let's do the next slide. I pick up the phone, and these are the kinds of messages I get. People say, I want a new culture. I want my company to have values. I want more innovation, more customer focus. I want to change the values. I'm just doing a merger, and I don't like the values that we have. I find this very funny. Let's go to the next slide, because what happens is people already have values, and they haven't really taken the time to examine what they are or how to use them. And I find it very funny, as an anthropologist, I understand that they can't just change their values by doing kind of a top-down edict. They have to really spend time and pull out the values that they do have and examine them. So in today's session, let's go to the next slide, we're going to do three things. We're going to talk about how values are formed and shaped. Where do they come from? How do you get them? How do you change them? And secondly, why values matter in the workplace. We're going to talk about the business case for doing values clarification in the workplace. And third, we're going to show you how to build a values-aligned team using the Values Edge toolkit. So let's go to the next slide. And what's interesting when I start talking about values in an organization, sometimes I get these horrible blank stares, kind of like these people here where they want to talk about their values, but they don't quite know what they are. And this is particularly true when I deal with leadership development. I'll never forget a group of people that I was working with, and I said, let's write down your 5 top values. And I get these very funny stares about, what? Not only why are we talking about values in the workplace, but secondly, I'm not sure I even know what my values are. So without let's take a minute here and let's try this on yourselves. Write down your 5 top values. I did this with a group of people last week and got some very interesting feedback. So write down your top 5 values and take a minute. And many people find this very hard to do because they either haven't been asked about their values, especially not in the workplace, or they have all these feelings about what they believe in, but they don't have the words to put around them. So that's the kind of challenge I found starting out talking about values in the workplace. When you look at your values, ask yourself, where did you learn these values? Have they changed as you've grown? How long have you had these values? Do you think they'll be different in another 20 years? Were they different 20 years ago? So let's keep this list in mind as we go through this session. And I think it will give you an opportunity to reflect and look at some of the exercises and the research we're going to talk about and connect the personal connection between your own values and the workplace values. So let's go to the next slide and look at how values are formed and shaped. Where did they come from? And why pay attention to them? Let's go to the next slide. Basically, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in culture. And culture is the manifestation of personal values. And all cultures are built on values. And because culture is the visible manifestation of values, it's the part we easily see. But values emerge from a set of conditions in the environment and in the economy and in the world, which lead to a set of beliefs about how things work, which then lead people to take certain actions, and then which lead to results. So let's think of it this way. If I have a value of honesty, and I then understand that I have a belief about I should tell the truth, the actions I would take would look like I do what I say I'm going to do. And the results would be that I create a trusted advisor relationship with my client, or if I'm building a team, I create a team that is accountable for its behavior. So if you want to build a culture of accountability, you need to work on the foundational values. You need to go backwards through this cycle and start with the conversation about values. So helping people connect their values to their behavior is a very important step in employee development and cultural development. Let's go to the next slide. Because as a source of navigation, values really help you figure out what's important in life. And that's the other part that I find, especially as we have increasing complexity both in our personal and work lives, we need to return and focus on values because it helps us decide what's important and how to make choices. And these values are an integral part of every culture. What's interesting is the values may manifest in different behaviors in different ways, but they are integral inside those behaviors. And they can be positive or negative. People can have negative values and be able to manifest those as well. And they emerge differently at different stages. The values that you have when you're entering the workplace may be different when you're in a senior management position. And marketers are very interested in values because they basically guide buying behavior, and they want to be able to message values or their messages that they create really substantially are talking to your values. So where do values come from? Let's go to the next slide. And basically, values are caught, not taught. And when we started our exercise about where did you learn these values, you probably learned them from a combination of family, and that can be an extended family. That doesn't have to be, your direct family. It can also be in a school environment. You spend a lot of hours being exposed to the school environment and in your larger community. And what's interesting about values, because you have them, you've been learning them since a very early age, you've created very strong neural pathways in your brain where they're embedded. They just feel natural and normal, that you've had experiences that have built that familiarity. Let's go to the next slide, and because we've done a lot of talking about the generation gap. And what's interesting and I find very helpful is the research that the Center for Creative Leadership has done. And basically what they've found in looking at values across generations, and that's why their work is called Retiring the Generation Gap, is that only family and integrity were chosen by more than half of the people that they surveyed. And they surveyed people in the workplace. They surveyed over 3,200 employees of all ages. So their research shows that there's no strong agreement among individuals about which specific values are the most important. And I think the most striking thing that they discovered was that generations don't have different values. Some people from each generation choose each of the values. So this is a helpful way to think, I think, beyond kind of the stereotype of Gen X wants this and Gen Y wants that, and think more broadly about values being expressed across the life cycle. So the next one, the next slide, actually continues this, and the Center for Creative Leadership really pulled forward and said, okay, so now we know about the values being similar across generations. What does everybody want in the workplace? And these were their 4 big findings. The first was that trust really matters, and all generations at all levels are more likely to trust people they work with directly. People trust their organizations less than they do the people they work with directly. And the less the people trust, the more likely they are to leave. So trust in the workplace as a foundational value is very important. The second one is respect. And basically, everyone wants respect. They just don't define it in the same way. People who have worked longer basically want their experience and their wisdom respected. Younger people would like to see their fresh ideas be heard. And one of the things that's important to help people in the workplace understand is that questions don't necessarily demonstrate disrespect. Find that often that people say they're disrespecting me because they're asking me questions. The third element is loyalty. And this is really dependent upon the context, not on the generation. And people higher in the organization look at it in different ways. And so different generations have about the same levels of loyalty. And the last one is nobody really likes change. And let's remember this is related to those neural pathways. We are animals of habit, and our brain is very happy when we have something kind of hardwired and figured out. And so when we change things, we basically disrupt the brain and the pathways. So nobody likes change, and it depends more on the context of how much change you're dealing with in your life, so rather than your generation. So I think that it's very helpful to kind of look at this generational piece as we explore more about values. So the next big question is, why do values matter in the workplace? And this is the business case. This is why we should even do, why would an organization want to take the time, add it to the offsite on leadership development or strategic planning? And there was really a foundational study that John Cotter and his colleague Heskett did in the early 1990s. And they did a landmark study. And they looked at 207 large U.S. companies in 22 different industries over an 11-year period. This was a substantial study. And they basically they found that companies that managed their cultures well saw amazing results. And these are, I write these out because it's sometimes unbelievable. But the revenues grew more than 4 times faster. The job creation was 7 times higher. The stock price grew 12 times faster. And the profit performance was 750 times higher. So this has been the landmark study where basically people said culture and values matter. Now, Daniel Dennison has continued this at University of Michigan, and he's looked at 34 large American firms. And he basically found that one of the most frequently cited studies of culture and performance was that in a participative culture, I mean a culture that valued trust, involvement, those kinds of things, had an ROI that averages nearly twice as high as those in firms with less efficient cultures. So Dennison's study provides the hard evidence that the culture and behavioral aspects of the organization are linked to both short and long-term performance. Now, Jeffrey Pfeiffer went on and continued this, and his research showed that companies that manage people right will outperform companies that don't by 30 to 40%. And a number of people have redone this over and over. And basically what we find is, and this is something I've been finding with teaching in the Presidio MBA in sustainability, is that the emerging focus on corporate social responsibility, i.e. sustainability, whatever language they give to it, I think is functioning as a proxy for these kind of basic values. And a number of organizations are using this sustainability focus as a way to spark retention and recruitment. One of the clients I worked on last year really was having a challenge in recruiting the younger generation. And by emerging a focus on sustainability, but it had to be authentic. It couldn't be just, kind of brand fluff. It had to be solidly installing a platform and a way that people could express their values in sustainability. So I think that sustainability is becoming kind of another way of that organizations are emerging this values focus. In the next slide, we kind of look at how values unlock employee engagement. So if you were to, and again, Collins and Porras did this again, building on that landmark study that Cotter and Heskett did about companies that are successful. And basically, the values alignment is essential for success. it's important to understand what values an organization currently has and how they were created. And when I work with an organization, I basically ask kind of the anthropologist question about what matters here and what behaviors, but not so much the behaviors, because again, remember the behaviors come out of values, but asking questions about what matters here, or what mattered to the founders, what mattered to the early leaders. I find that actually the founding generation or the founding leaders usually had a set of values that they wanted to convey in their organization. So in working with a leadership team, you kind of go back to what did the founders value and have a conversation about that, because that builds a platform for employee engagement. So let's look at some of the benefits of what shared values provide people with. This is the water cooler. And basically what shared values give people is a common language. And this is often underestimated. It may sound very simple, but it's very hard to do. And MIT had a very interesting study that showed if you have an organization with no convening place, no water fountain, no coffee pot, no cafeteria, those kind of places, no break room, then it's very hard to build a shared language. I think this is very important, that you don't do it just on a virtual platform. And there's something about the human element that is still very important in building a way that people can talk to each other. Now, I work a lot with mergers in organizations, and one of the things they need most desperately in the beginning is this shared language. And when I was doing cultural due diligence on a merger, it was really about how could we create these structured conversations where these two companies, which were actually on different continents and from different cultural backgrounds, could come together. And so structuring these conversations and being able to create ways that people could talk to one another and share their values was very important. So basically, I said it all came down to the cafeteria. Would people from the two different companies start to talk to each other and have lunch together? So one of the things we did is we had shared food, and we had different groups host potlucks of their own kind of native cuisine in different times in the cafeteria, and it started to have a very how do I say it? I think it's a very easy way to start these conversations about shared values. What happens is there are three things that you can begin to do to get this common language going. Let's go to the next slide. The first thing is give people a chance to express their own values. People admire those people who believe strongly in something. And in any workplace, everybody believes strongly in something. They're just not often asked. And basically, people whose personal values match those of their company feel significantly more strongly attached to their work. So this shines light on the opportunity of having conversations about personal passion in the workplace. And the way we do that, I actually do that with my students in leadership. I ask them to bring their I voice into the workplace. What do they believe? A lot of times the emphasis is on the we voice. What do we believe? But I think it's very important to go to the I voice before we go to the we voice. So this is an example of people being able to shape their own language and articulate their own values, strengthens them. The next thing that people begin to do is leaders share their values. And again, this is kind of a foundational part of any leadership development program. It's not about talking about the company's values, it's about talking about the person's values, and in that, you know, where did they catch those values? Why do they believe that? So in coaching executives, it's very important to help them emerge their story of their values. And shared values, again, build this common language. One of my favorite exercises I do actually do it with my students at Presidio, is give them one page of flip chart paper. And I say, you have, 3 minutes to create an image and then talk about your values for 3 minutes. And one of my favorite students is a very serious engineer. I'm just like, I don't draw, I don't want to do this, this is stupid, and I said, okay, just draw some shape. And he got up and he drew a diamond. And basically he said, the first base is about, this, and the second base is about this. And he gave a very impassioned, personalized, authentic description of his own 4 values by just using one image, a triangle, a diamond shape, and getting up in front and going through the discomfort. I find a lot of leaders are very discomforted with talking personally, but the most compelling ones do it flawlessly. So that's the second thing, where you're building these kind of values-based cultures. The third thing is to use values as a focus for conversation. And this is actually a picture of the beginning of the offsite of this company that was coming together with 2 different cultures. And I am actually very sneaky when I want to get a senior team together. I take them to this offsite place, and the cell phones don't work there, which is very helpful when you have a team of people who really don't think they have time to do this. And this was the beginning of a conversation of talking about their own personal values, and then how did the personal values match with the organization's values. And the other thing that I find is that by putting values in the center of the conversation, you can talk about the values rather than about each other, and it creates a different level of conversation and candidness and clarity. So what we did is we included a discussion of values in their strategic planning, and we actually began with where they came from and what were their fundamental personal values, and then how did they bring those into the workplace. So it's often that conversation that gets skipped, because we could have gone directly to work values and spent lots of time there. But what we did is we really started with themselves. And that's one of the things that I've really found over and over, is that there's real benefits of aligning these individual and organizational values. If we go to the next slide, these are the things that I find emerge when you take the time, and they're actually part of the findings of Kouzes and Posner as they studied values over the years, that basically job stress and tension are reduced because people have a sense of clarity about what the leaders and what they want to bring to the workplace. And it really, the shared stories that come from talking about values fosters a sense of pride in the organization. And again, having an opportunity where a person can talk about their own values gives them a sticky story, a story that has interest and attention, that will compel somebody else to remember who they are. It's very important. And the third thing is that the teamwork and spirit begins to be fostered with a combination of this I and we language. And the loyalty grows in an organization that allows and fosters conversations about values. So when I'm approached by an organization or a team that says, we want to strengthen our capacity, I always start them with their values, because the values are the foundation of their behavior and the choices that they make then as they build their organization. So let's talk about how to build values-aligned team, because that's where the work often begins, and I think that's what the Values Edge is most useful for, is to help you guide these conversations, these values-based conversations in the workplace. Because over the years, as I picked up the phone and got these funny calls, I kept finding that I wanted to create an accelerated process by which people could have these conversations about values. And it led me to put what I knew in a book called Organizational Values, Vision, and Mission, because those are the three basic building blocks of any leadership team, is to figure out what your values are, what your vision is, and your mission of how you're going to get there, how those strategic initiatives are going to align. And the anthropologist in me, if I was working for a bus company, I would actually go out and ride the buses, and I would ask the bus drivers, what are you doing here? What matters? And whether it was a power company or a packaged goods company, I just found that going to the break rooms or going, on the shuttle bus that takes the people from the employee parking lot, that's where I do my kind of finding out whether people understand what's going on. And if they go, I don't know, anything. It's like it's just a job, then you know that you have a disconnect, or that you have an opportunity to give people a chance to bring who they are to the workplace. And so my book grew out of helping organizations find a way to really harness this power of clarity with connecting personal values to organizational values. And when I started to write the book and kind of looked back at where I basically looked back at a number of pieces of research that helped me design these tools. And this is my picture of the foundation, because I find it's very important to really acknowledge people who have done foundational research in this. And Milton Rokeach did some very basic work, foundational work, where he came up with 18 terminal and 18 intrinsic values. And one of the things that I've always found is that there's always this great research, but it's in a language or a format that's hard to apply at scale. And so one of my favorite things to do is to take people's original research and repackage it in a way that makes it accessible. And I think that's what we've been doing with the Values Edge. So Milton Rokeach's was very foundational. Sid Simon did some very fun work with large group values clarification conversations in education, and applied it to large groups. Collins and Porras did their work on successful habits of visionary companies, and Ari DeGoose did a very interesting study of 27 companies, mainly in Europe, long-lived companies that had been going for a long time, and basically found that values were at the center of that longevity. And then Kouzes and Posner have looked at over 20,000 people on 4 continents and came up with the importance of values, and especially the importance of working on personal values first. So if we look at measuring organizational commitment and translating this into what does this all mean, and where does it pay off? And basically Kouzes and Posner found that people who have the greatest clarity about both their personal and organizational values have the highest degree of commitment to the organization. So to me, this is the key to unlocking engagement. You don't get engagement by passing out hats, cups, t-shirts, whatever. You get engagement by letting people become clear about their personal values in the context of the organization's values. And the net-net really is that personal values drive commitment, and that personal values are the route to loyalty and commitment, not organizational values. And clarity about personal values is more important in your attitude about work than clarity about organizational values alone. So if you look at the right-hand column, and that's really showing that if you're high in clarity about your personal values, and you get a little bump when you go up to being connected to your organization's values, but the real meaning in this is that personal values come first. And this was on a scale of 1 to 7. So you've got a real difference between people who don't understand their personal values, and if you don't understand your personal values, you can't connect them to the organization's values. So what's interesting about this is it really flipped it for me and said, okay, we have to do personal values first. And so this is the next step. So we know you really get the bang for the buck, if you will, if you start with personal values. So what I've been doing and working with in organizations is starting with the personal values. Let's go to the next slide. Because I've seen organizations make some pretty consistent mistakes. I have walked into organizations and they have those values posters on the wall, and either they've bought them and they're somebody else's values, or they're their own values, but they're pasted in the break room and they're sent out to all the locations, and they're told to be put up, you know, so everyone can see them. And that's really the top-down rollout that does not work, because people have no attachment to it. And you know, I've seen the values cards that you're supposed to put in your wallet. I've seen the tent cards. I've seen the all kinds of ways that organizations have tried to, in some ways, create a campaign, a marketing campaign out of their values. And what I find is that if they would just spend some time, and it doesn't take a lot of time, maybe a couple hours to have these conversations, and you can break it up into 15-minute conversations. I'll tell you later about an organization that we broke it up into 15-minute conversations. But starting with the personal values and then rolling to the team values and then connecting it, so it's a bottoms-up, top-down process. So how do you clarify personal values, and how can you do that in a way that helps people remember them and doesn't take a lot of time? And let's talk a little bit about how I created the values edge system, because in my first remember I said I had these people that I would ask what their values were, and they would kind of give me these blank stares. Basically, we came up with using Roquiche as a foundation and then adding some additional values over a number of different iterations. We came up with 56 cards that have values, and they don't have definitions on them, they just have the values. And we asked people to sort those values, those 56 values, and we also have a conversation guide, because people need to talk about what it means in their sorting. So if we look at the different steps of the values edge process, let's look at the first thing we do. And we actually take people, and these cards are sorted. And you see the woman here with 3 piles of always, sometimes, and rarely. And you take the 56 cards and you shuffle them and you start sorting them. Now, there's a lot of groaning that often goes on because you're asked to make 3 piles and do it really fast. And what happens is people often, and then I stop them and say, who has more, how many cards do you have in your always pile? And I've had people with 46 cards in their always pile, or, and I say, okay, so now what you have to do is you have to push away those other 2 piles and only get the top pile and choose 15. Because people can't focus, and actually people can't focus on more than 5 to 7 things at a time. That's what the brain research shows us. So asking people to sort down to 15 values is often very, very hard. And so you have the whole room kind of groaning that they have to do this. But what it does for people is it's a forced sort. And helping people to clarify what they already know is very energizing. So what then people do, and the second step, is they identify their group or team values. And they begin to say, and you'll notice here that the 2 people have different colors, which means their values, they have different values, and they're creating a pyramid of their top value, and then the second, and then the next 3, and the 4, and the 5. And so what they're doing is really beginning to look at their own choices. And you don't have to have total alignment in a group. And the other I think concern people have is that if you do this in the work group, people will have different values, and yes, they will. and actually that gives people a lot of affirmation for having different values. The other thing about starting with personal values, I think it's very important to acknowledge that people want to have, that they are allowed to have personal values that do not come into the workplace, or that they don't have to have, all their personal values don't have to be brought into the workplace. And I think that's a very important distinction for people who are really trying to balance work-life kind of values. There are some things that you do want to keep and can keep in your own personal expression. And the next step here in identifying group or team values is to ask people, after they've done their own personal sorting, to pick 5 that they really want in the workplace. And then they put those all together in the center. And what they begin to find is that they are often the same. Another part of this is to have people actually, if you're doing it with teams or groups, I've done it with 600 people in a room, but you work in table groups. Go around the table and see what their colleagues value. And it's not a time to talk, but it is a time to really look at the patterns that are emerging and talk about patterns, because people can talk about patterns rather than persons, and it's a much safer conversation. And I think the other thing that this step does is it allows people to see that they don't have to agree to everything to work in the company that you're in, that there can be a variation. What sometimes happens, though, is if you have people that have very different values from everybody else, it begins to call the question, is this the right place for me? Am I in a place that values what I value? So the third step is to really take these values and then figure out what the behavior is. What are the behaviors that demonstrate these values? Because they're vague on purpose, especially because we use them all over the world. We don't want them to be defined in a certain way. And what happens is, like, you'll have a behavior like teamwork. Everybody wants teamwork. Well, what does that actually mean? And then the group or the organization has to define how would we be behaving if we had teamwork? What would we do? Would we answer each other's phones? Would we, empty the dishwasher or fill the dishwasher? Those are the common issues. So identifying specific behaviors is a very rich generative conversation and helps people really sort out what they mean by these values. So the fourth step is really to help people align the personal and the team values with the organizational strategy. And that's the really rich conversation. You'll see the tent card kind of lined up here with a little colored pyramid. And what people do is they start talking about where do these values show up and how does that reflected in our strategy? How do we see these things happening? And you'll notice here that the people have different colors, different words in their values pyramid. It just sparks a very interesting generative conversation. And you can do this in an hour. This doesn't have to take a long time. And what people walk away with is that little tent card with their own personal values. And on the inside, there's kind of a mini action plan where people can begin to, look at what their focus is and what they would like to develop. The way organizations take this fourth step is they start to look at, well, what does this mean for talent? And, what are the values of the people we're attracting? And how can we support those values? How can we accentuate those values? How can we articulate those values all the way through our hiring, recruitment, retention process? So let me talk just a little bit about the values model that we use and what these colors are. And basically, there's kind of two large ways that people deal with values. One is more of a developmental model that basically says, you start with these values and they develop, and in some cases it implies there's a subtle implication that lower values are less good than the upper values. What I wanted to do, what Dennis Jaffe and I wanted to do, was really build something where people could have that in a more of a style model. And what we did is we divided them into 7 categories based on the Rokeach early modeling, and looked at the 7 kinds of values that people have and how much they've developed each one of those areas. Now the green, the intrinsic, are ones that are basically global, foundational good. Very few people, like integrity, the kinds of things that Rokeach and others found is that people wouldn't argue with those things. And sometimes you have people who sort a lot of green into their values decks, or sometimes you have people who sort no green, basically because they feel like they have those values packed inside. What's around those values are the different kind of stylistic expressions. And the orange at the top is really all the values that have to do with achievement and individual pursuit and winning and mastery. And the red are about self-expression, searching for personal challenge and development. And the pink ones are about inner development and reflection and curiosity about inner balance. And the yellow was about lifestyle and personal well-being and paying attention to health and other kind of expressions of that. And the blue were really knowing where things fit and how people will treat each other, a lot about stability and continuity. And the purple were about helping and working with others. So what we found is that as people stacked up their pyramid and turned over the cards and exposed the colors, they often had a balance. They had all the colors displayed. Some people would have none of one of the colors. And if you think of that as a developmental model, you can kind of see that, let's say, especially in the workplace, I'll never forget the group of Japanese businessmen that had nothing but orange values. There were orange cards all across their tables. And it was like, oh, I've forgotten actually they had orange and blue. Oh, I've forgotten anything about lifestyle or inner development or self-expression. So if you treat this as a conversation, if you spend the first hour kind of clarifying some of these things, you can do the second conversation about what things would round out your wheel. You know, do you have flat spots? What things are you not paying attention to? Or what things would you like to pay more attention to? So let's talk about a couple of the applications, and I want to tell a few stories here about using this values edge system and using values to kind of sort through two areas. One is helping a large bank that deals with a lot of families facing how do they pass on their wealth? How do they figure out how to bring the next generation into this conversation? And what they're doing is they're using this values edge card sort process to help develop an articulation between generations. So they're actually sorting the cards, having the first generation and the second generation sort their cards differently, and then come together and have the conversation about what do we all care about, and then using that as the foundation for creating the value statement for their family foundations. So actually the people at the bank use the Values Edge Kit and have these conversations in a trusted advisor relationship with these families. And some of them, sometimes they do it in retreats, and sometimes they just do it in, in the office. So that's an application where it's used with people who need to have a shared conversation. The second example is really, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can use these individually in organizations and also around career development, helping people figure out what kinds of work really fits with their values. This other application was with a major restaurant chain that had been growing a lot, and as they grew, they wanted to make sure that the additional locations were keeping the values. So it's keeping the values strong. And at first they were going to do the traditional wall poster rollout. They said they wanted to create a kit and send it out to all the restaurants and have them put the values up in the break room. And I said, no, could we do it something differently? Could we, and this is where I said we got it down to 15-minute little conversations, because that's when the staff would have their huddle as they started the shift. And once a week, they would take one of the values and discuss what are the behaviors around that value and how do they see. The question was, where do we see this value showing up in the workplace, and how do we see it? And so it gave the employees a way of creating that shared language and a way of being able to express what they saw and affirm each other. So those are two very short examples of how we've used the Values Edge conversation kits in different places. And if I was to really summarize a little bit about that, this whole values thing, we've looked at a lot of studies and seen that unity is really forged, not forced. And there's no one specific set of successful values. And this is the other thing I get asked all the time. What are the good values? Which values should I have? And basically, you have the values that you have. The task is to find expression and places, workplaces, whatever, where those values really support that direction. So there is no one specific set of successful values. You can look back at the research and you can see, collaborative versus, forced kind of organizations, but there's no one magic set. And the other thing is, different values work at different times for different organizations. A startup needs to have different values than a mature organization. And that the common understanding of values comes from a process, not a pronouncement. And the most The things that don't work is the senior team goes off and figures out their values, and then they come and roll them out on the organization. And those things don't work because you end up going very fast to go very slow. And if I can say anything, it's like take the time to generate the clarity from the bottom up, and then you'll have a very powerfully aligned organization. And as I said, successful companies have different values at different times. And if you've gone from a startup into a more mature organization, or you're beginning to scale, you may need to refresh and relook at your values to say, those were important then and these are important now. It really helps to do a reset. And then don't mistake the ability of an organization to have this kind of generative dialogue, or really listen to the dissonant voices. A values clarification process in an organization should not make people feel that they have to be silent and compliant. There should be room for diversity in perspective, and that's often the key to innovation. So in kind of looking back, and how does a leader, do this? We've talked about how does a person do this, but basically leaders can do this simply. It doesn't take, cards or or posters or whatever. You can start asking questions. What's our purpose? That's kind of my basic, ride in the truck, sit on the bus. What do you do here? What makes meaning here? What's important here? What's the ultimate impact we seek? You can put that into, because the questions that leaders ask give people a focus, and they say, this is important. And so this is a way that you can make values part of a daily or weekly conversation. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It can be just, how are you doing, and how are you seeing our values in play here? And as a way of summarizing, as we kind of come to the end of this session, it's important to look at what people stand for. I love this quote from Robert Haas, and actually I had the pleasure of working with him in his organization to see how he expressed this and really used it as a foundation of competitive success. He was really very outspoken about himself personally, about how his values drove the business. So if I was to say 3 things to take away here, is that values conversations are a key to unlocking employee engagement. And if you want engaged employees, start them and ask them what their values are and listen. The second thing is to do personal values before organizational values. And thirdly, that strong leaders use values to talk about the why, in addition to the how and the what. So what I hope you take away from this is that an understanding that values matter. It doesn't have to take a long time to generate a conversation about them, and that the business case is very strong for doing this in organizations. And you don't have to start with the whole organization. You can start with your team. So it's been a pleasure to take you on this whirlwind tour of values, and I have enjoyed this and look forward to answering any of your questions. Looks like we're going to probably have to do that online, but I would be glad to get back to you on that, and want to turn it back to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Your content here, we've gotten some great feedback from our attendees today already. And we do have some questions coming in, so continue to send those questions in. Cynthia will respond to each of those. We'll actually compile all of the questions and her responses and email that to everyone, so that everyone can see what the questions that came in and what Cynthia's answers are. So go ahead and send those in to us now. And we do want to give you an opportunity, if you are interested in rolling out the Values Edge system with your team or in your organization, for joining us today. You do get a 30% discount. We also have a 30-day return policy on our materials. You can take a look at the full facilitator guide, the reusable values deck cards, and then also the participant takeaway materials as well. The coupon code you want to use is Values Webinar, and that's good until July 31st. And if you have any questions on the content of the product, how to use that, or anything that Cynthia covered today, please feel free to send those questions in to us. We really appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.